Thanks for joining me. I'm Giulio Pugliese. I'm a lecturer in Japanese politics and international relations at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. And I'm part-time professor here for the newly inaugurated EU-Asia project at the European University Institute. I co-lead the program together with Ken Endo, professor at Hokkaido University. We are delighted to have you here for our Kickstart event following keynote speeches by Secretary General of the Democratic Party, Enrico Letta, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Motegi, and the President of Japan and former Ambassador to Italy, Umemoto. We are going to continue this first day of online discussions with three important takes that will eventually be published as policy briefs, if not policy papers, for the Robert Schuman Center of Advanced Studies series, and you will find them open access soon in the Robert Schuman Center's website. And these papers will deal with really setting up the strategic framework for Europe/EU Japan cooperation in the so-called Indo-Pacific. And we're going to have a very fruitful discussion by Dr. Gudrun Bakker, a senior fellow at the SWP in Berlin, Andrew Small, senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and Professor Michito Tsuruoka from Keio University. Eva Peshova, the co-head of the Japan program at the Free University of Brussels, will kindly discuss the ideas proposed here. And here we are really going to look at the big macro picture of how European players, starting with France, Germany, and Holland, and eventually, as Borrell and Managing Director for East Asia and Asia Pacific, Gunnar Vigan, has made clear, the EU will endow itself with an Indo-Pacific strategy or policy of sorts. And we will have a sense of what is the European approach to the Indo-Pacific, and why is it, for instance, different from, if at all, from a free and open Indo-Pacific? It is by name. And what are the similarities between the stances of these three important member states? What is the shape that the EU's Indo-Pacific outlook or policy will look like? And what are the differences with Japan and the US, and what are the complementarities? Andrew Small will talk about a set of very important coordination mechanisms on the economic front. And by economics, we don't mean just global governments, global governance, which EUI is particularly strong on, and we have a range of economists that will talk about the European and Japanese approaches to trade and WTO questions. But Andrew Small will talk also about economic security and the important issues surrounding the vexata question of distorted market practices within the WTO, but also issues pertaining to connectivity. So these are all important developments in the blooming relationship between Europe and Japan, and of course the United States of America, with its calls for an alliance of techno-democracies versus techno-autocracies, has also played an important role. And then, last but not least, Professor Tsuruoka will talk about Japan's positioning in the trilateral agenda, but also with an eye of how Europe has understood its engagement with the Indo-Pacific by looking at one, US-China confrontation, but also at China itself and the way that Chinese behavior has changed the Europeans' approach to the Indo-Pacific and how Japan fits into the picture. And so, without further ado, I leave the floor to Dr. Wacker. Please be reminded that we will have a 10-minute presentation for each panelist, and then Dr. Peshova will be very kind to jump into the conversation with her comments. Perhaps if she wants, she can raise questions, and then panelists will be able to respond and dialogue between each other. And then following that, we will have a Q&A session. So without further ado, Dr. Wacker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for letting me be a part of this inaugural event of the European University Institute. I was asked to talk about the differences and commonalities, or compare a little bit the three approaches of France, Germany, and the Netherlands, the three European member states that have so far put forward some sort of paper on the Indo-Pacific. And I'm happy to do that. So I will address 3 points. One is a little bit the background and context of what is going on in the European Union. Then the actual 3 papers will be addressed and how the EU is moving forward. And I will talk a little bit about the challenges in the end. I think the Europeans can be said to be late to the game when it comes to adopting the term Indo-Pacific. When we think back to Abe's speech in 2007 in India, where he talked about the confluence of the 2 seas, and other countries like Australia, the US, and also India warming up to this term over the next years. In Europe, it was really France was the first country that embraced the Indo-Pacific concept. Macron gave a speech in Australia, and after that, this was in 2018, there followed papers by the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Ministry. Germany, in September last year, published very comprehensive guidelines on the Indo-Pacific, and the Netherlands followed in November 2020 with a non-paper. So we already see some differences. Germany, a very comprehensive whole of government approach. In France, more limited, but France is working on a more comprehensive paper, and the Netherlands with a non-paper. The German and the Dutch paper explicitly say that their approaches are to be understood as building blocks to a European positioning on the Indo-Pacific. Giulio, you already mentioned the EU, from my perspective, is moving faster than expected. There was the blog of Josep Borrell last week, and also the prospect that we might see some sort of Indo-Pacific positioning in April this year, which is surprising to me. So there seems to be a certain momentum. So what are the differences between the French, German, Netherlands approach? I think France is sticking out because it comes from a different starting point than Germany and the Netherlands. It's the only European member state that sees itself as a resident power in the region, because it has overseas territories. It has 1.6 million French citizens in this vastly defined Indo-Pacific space, and it has huge exclusive economic zones that come with these overseas territories. It has a military presence. So one of the basic and fundamental interests of France is to safeguard their national interests in the region. But of course, the French approach goes beyond that. Germany and the Netherlands come from a very different angle. Their main motivations are the fact that they are big trading nations that depend on open sea lanes and the free access to markets. And their second motivation is the interest the vital interest in safeguarding and defending a rules-based order at the international level, but also at the regional level. There are other differences like the geographic space defined as Indo-Pacific, which is a little bit vague on the German side. For the French, it's natural to look at their overseas territories, and that's the boundaries of the Indo-Pacific. But also the documents we have are very different in length and status, government agencies involved, etc. But there is a critical mass, I would say, of fundamental commonalities between the three countries. First of all, they agree in their basic assessment of the strategic trends in the Indo-Pacific and the importance this has for the European Union and our interests in security and prosperity. There is also agreement on the basic objectives to be achieved. I think on the rules-based order, this is the very fundamental approach of Europeans to the region. It's also inclusive of China, and there it's different from the US approach, even if the US does not downright say we exclude China, but it's very clear that this is the adversary. So we say we have an inclusive approach, and we also underline ASEAN centrality, and I would even argue that the timing of the German and the Dutch paper have to do with the fact that ASEAN has put forward its own outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which made it less confrontational from the point of view of Germany, at least, to embrace the concept. I think that the fundamental goal is that we want to promote multilateralism, and we neither want a unipolar nor a bipolar Indo-Pacific region. And what the EU is trying to accomplish is diversify and deepen the partnerships beyond China, which I think is long overdue in the region, and also to lower the dependency on China. This is not only to be pursued at the national level, but within the EU and other contexts, which is very important, like the G7, the G20, the UN organizations, and the Alliance for Multilateralism. And the German and Dutch paper also mentioned NATO and NATO's global partnerships as one element of the Indo-Pacific approach. Final point, the challenges. There are many, I would say. The first is a coordinated division of labor between the member states and the European Union. As long as, you know, we have this mix, Natalie Tocci said in the morning session that to come up with a common position or a strategy is also for internal communication within the EU to get everybody on the same page and build a consensus, but we're not there yet. So there needs to be a certain division of labor because the EU cannot take over certain tasks. And I already talked about other contexts in which the member states can become active. Then the second challenge I see is to have the sustained political will and to provide the necessary financial and human resources, diplomatic resources, and military resources to really make this a sustainable effort that delivers on the expectations that we have created in the region. And then there is the question of the coordination and cooperation with the United Kingdom, because they came out with their own tilt to the Indo-Pacific in the integrated review last week. For me, the biggest challenge is the question of the US-China rivalry. Because the US is hardly mentioned in the papers that we have seen so far as a cooperation partner. It's only mentioned within the context of this big rivalry going on, which we are not interested in, escalating. So what we try to do in these papers, I think, is squaring the circle, and more or less the UK tries the same in their paper. So the question how we position ourselves in this ongoing rivalry is very unclear. And it's not clear how we will position ourselves and what our priorities are if hard choices have to be made. It's not thought through in the documents. And so I think it's really clear that it's very different from the US position in a way, in that it basically says, in German, we have a saying, wash me, but don't make me wet. So we try to navigate this space, if there is a space, and argue from the standpoint of small and medium powers. And I think maybe the good thing is that there are like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific who also see themselves as small and medium powers and are not interested in becoming the playground of two giants beating each other up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very comprehensive kickstart to our webinar, and I take it that when you mentioned and listed the diversification of partnerships beyond China, in a sense, from your final remarks, it looks almost as if we were also trying to diversify, if at all possible, from entanglement in a US-China policy that is that contains the seeds of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Perhaps this is not how you would put it, and perhaps it is closer to playing a concert of middle powers that tries instead to cajole the United States into a more constructive position, which would be perhaps a different way of putting it, but really with the same starting point. Now, we move to Andrew Small, who has a lot to tell us of the ongoing cooperation at the economic level and economic security level, if not at the technological level, and between Japan, the EU, and the US, and what are also the fault lines and where that cooperation is particularly complicated. Andrew, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julio. And like Gudrun, I'm very grateful to be part of this inaugural event. As you laid out in the introduction, I'm going to be covering the trilateral and within that also the transatlantic cooperation agenda on the economic side, where I think the arrival of the Biden administration has really given us the opening for a kind of more expansive framework of cooperation between the United States, the EU, and Japan on strategic economic questions for reasons that are, of course, largely driven by China. In practice, we did make a certain amount of progress on these issues during the Trump administration. The trilateral meetings between the three trade ministers were one of the really few structured, open, high-level efforts to try to come up with a common approach among major economic powers in dealing with China, in particular Chinese non-market practices. And we were able to reach joint positions in areas such as subsidies and forced technology transfers. Beyond that, there were also a number of other areas where the three sides made some progress towards a more coordinated approach. This included export controls, rules around investment screening, dealing with certain specific choke point technologies, and to a certain extent, even with all the obvious caveats around it, security principles around 5G. I think there were also some obvious big bilateral breakthroughs that could be seen as serving for building blocks for a trilateral approach in future. Most obviously, the EU-Japan FTA and the data advocacy agreement, but the EU-Japan partnership on connectivity and some of the parallel exchanges on that on the EU-US side, as well as the, I think, much more comprehensive efforts on the US-Japan side, including the Blue Dot Network, I think are all likely to come to the fore again in the coming months as some of these connectivity plans start moving forward again. But the limitations of all this were very obvious even at the time. Trilateral process, of course, was limited by internal trade tensions, particularly the use of the 232 and 301 tariffs, by the Trump administration's wider economic strategy, particularly in dealing with the WTO, and just the overall state of particularly the transatlantic relationship, even aside from the differences actually in the talks over questions such as state aid. The level of communication that took place between the three sides rather on different China negotiations that were taking place was incredibly minimal. And then on the transatlantic side specifically, although there were supposedly consultations over technology transfers to China and some other sensitive areas, it was a pretty pervasive sense, I would say, on the European side, whether it was from European governments or from companies, of just being subjected to decisions over which they didn't really have a meaningful say, even in some of the areas where we were able to reach some convergence in terms of some of the decisions that were taken on the US side. I'd also say, apart from the trade trilateral, most of these areas of coordination and cooperation only really move forward at a working level and in pretty self-contained silos. In fact, in some of these areas, people, generally speaking, don't even know some of the progress that was made on these fronts in the last few years. It meant there was not a huge amount of scope for more kind of consolidated thinking on a coordinated approach to China-related economic strategy between the three parties. I think perhaps needless to say, with President Trump, summit-level meetings such as the G7 were not occasions where this was seriously possible, and it had been a little bit more tentatively possible to have those sorts of discussions, at least in the late stages of the Obama administration. The Biden administration has, of course, come to office with a very different approach to China. In theory, there are some clear points of continuity. The concept of the Indo-Pacific that Gudrun was just discussing has now really become a much more embedded part of US strategy. I think there is a deeper commitment on the US government and in Congress to this wider region being now the dominant theater for US policy and wider strategy. I think there is a sense that the fundamental reappraisal of China policy that took place under the Trump administration was seen as necessary by the Biden team. I think this view that competition with China has to treat economics, technology, and even ideology every bit essentially as it does the kind of military balancing that had always been there is going to stick. And some of the most important moves that we saw on export controls, investment restrictions, and areas of competing more effectively with the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, were really driven by Congress as much as the administration, and I think they're going to stick too. Though the implementation in some of these areas, such as supply chain realignment and technology restrictions, I think are more likely than during the Trump administration to be underpinned by economic modeling, more thorough consultation processes with partners and domestically with US firms as well. And a lot of that will move ahead over the next year. But I think the points of critique that the Biden team had of the Trump administration are at least as important as the points of continuity. And the central one has still been that it was a confrontational approach to China without competing effectively. That it failed to mobilize allies behind US strategy, that it failed to address the domestic drivers of US competitiveness in a serious way, essentially that it focused on the kind of counter-China dimensions of policy rather than the strengthening US capabilities and partner capabilities. That regional institutions in Asia and the multilateral and even plurilateral space was not taken seriously enough, whether that was the East Asia Summit or the G7. And I think still a perception that there was perhaps insufficient space in the relationship with China afforded to be able to pursue some limited areas of cooperation where necessary, and also just a better way of managing conflict between the US and China. I think some in the Biden team also thought that they saw kind of an overestimation of how much the US could change China's behavior, including with kind of tariff measures. And I think believed that US strategy, including in the economic realm, should be more focused around how do you live with the fact that China's not going to change in these areas than trying to kind of elicit change through pressure. And as we've seen in even just recent weeks on some of the areas of continuity, technology restrictions, the Phase 1 China deal itself, we've also seen some of the critiques as well as the commonalities starting to turn into policy. Some of the early visits, the calls, the summits, and the language from the new administration has signaled this more partner-centered approach to China, greater focus on stitching together allies in Europe and Asia, and then a kind of more democratic values-based emphasis. And I think we've started to see some initial efforts to sketch out what it would mean to do more of a focus on the competition with China rather than the counter-China pieces, particularly in the domestic industrial policy plans, which are still in motion, some of the focus on support for the technology and innovation base, and some of the early work that's being done on supply chains on the US side. I think on the economic side, though, the ally cooperation agenda can really come out in quite different places. Here, I think the crux of it is really going to be as much on the transatlantic side rather than the trilateral one. I think between Japan and the US, Japan and the EU, a lot of the really big issues and the hardest issues on trade, data flows, and some other areas did actually make reasonable progress, even in the last few years. Whereas on the transatlantic front, I think we're still really lagging behind. And I think that's really going to be at the fore of the agenda in the next couple of years. So I'll kind of focus my remaining remarks just on the transatlantic piece specifically. And I'd say there's a kind of thin version or a thick version of what that cooperation might look like on the transatlantic side. The thin version is basically an extension and upgrading of all of the prior exchanges that were taking place with some of the big irritants removed. That means getting rid of 232 tariffs, closing the gaps on the WTO appellate body, and then basically going down this kind of issue list that would include, and this is going to be list-like, but I think we have to kind of go through this gamut of areas: connectivity finance, shared negotiating strategies on Chinese trade and investment questions, elevating and broadening some of the coordination on Chinese access to emerging technologies, joint WTO cases, including possibly a kind of big Jennifer Hillman style case, if you've seen that theory advanced rather than some of the sector specific ones, regulatory and standards cooperation, particularly on emerging technologies where standards are still in the process of being devised, and then kind of just better coordination of economic instruments in general, including in some of the areas where the EU has really moved ahead in recent years and the US is actually still lagging behind, particularly the use of competition policy and the targeting of Chinese subsidies in third countries. I think if successful, that would really represent an advance on the situation of the last few years, but it also has its limitations. I think the nature of and the stakes really in economic and technology competition with China are such that you arguably do need progress on some of the more politically challenging areas too. If we're really going to move forward with the kind of mutual capacity, scale building, joint rule setting, and basically do system competition or rivalry with China kind of as a common system rather than as distinct ones. And I think the thicker areas, if you were to advance those kind of pieces of cooperation as well, would include principles underlying the digital space, particularly with reference to data privacy, platform regulation, and all of the data flows issues, just beyond the Schrems II fix. The wider approach to the global trading order beyond the WTO, including whether we were able to get back to a serious plurilateral agenda, which looks tricky with this administration at the moment. Joint approaches to supply chain security, reconciling positions on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, deconfliction and kind of joint efforts really between the two sides on industrial policy, which is really not happening yet. And then some more common principles on how we go about sort of adjusting our openness to non-like-minded actors. And I think finally, actually, and as was mentioned earlier, just what our overall offer in the developing world looks like, whether it's development finance or green transition plans, or the kind of trade and technology partnerships that we put on offer. I'm kind of just running out of time, but just one thing that I would kind of flag, I mean, progress on all of those areas is going to be difficult. I think without progress on any of those areas, we're probably going to fall short of some of the joint efforts required. But I think beyond the issue-specific reasons, there are some wider transatlantic differences right now that are not just about the question of primacy that I think came up in the earlier panel. In particular now, I do think the Biden economic approach starts from quite a different premise from the Europeans. More skeptical about the value of deepening commercial ties with China at all. I think that's partly the result of questions represented by the whole kind of foreign policy for the middle class agenda about whether overall US economic interests are as well aligned with US multinationals' interest in moving production facilities, focusing on sales in the Chinese market, as they were traditionally understood to be, but partly also just because of the much more explicit plans on China's part to weaponize dependency and securitize economic strategy, as we see through the dual circulation strategy, self-reliance push that's really moved forward very quickly in the last few months. And I think it means that you have on the US side emerging something that's actually even more so than the Trump administration, a less China-centric economic policy, less focused on the bilateral relationship or phase 2 trade deals, a lot more focused on economic diversification and supply chain rebalancing and domestic economic strategy, not further market opening. The EU, I think, has maintained the view that sees this push for structural economic reform and market access, bilateral negotiations, WTO disciplines, all of these traditional means of dealing with China as still viable. And even with all the new defensive tools that are being developed, I think the Comprehensive Investment Agreement in particular is kind of an embodiment of an approach that a lot of other actors, including the US, now really see as rooted in a kind of old paradigm of thinking about China. I think all of the issues on the thick and thin cooperation list, which are centrally conditioned by China, are not China-centric in their entirety. And there's a lot of the analysis about the challenge in building a coordinated approach to China that rests on the idea that Europe doesn't want to pick sides, doesn't like bloc politics and these things. A lot of these are just positive sum joint efforts in areas such as connectivity, standard setting, all of which are going to have a critical impact on the competition agenda with China, even without there being a kind of joint public counter-China stance. And I think even without there being a philosophical alignment on the continued value of prioritizing the Chinese market at all. And with apologies for running over, I will.
Thank you. Those were very thought-provoking remarks. It would be fascinating to see where Japan stands in between these two approaches, because of course Japan has deep economic ties with China, and does it actually fit with what Andrew was referring to when the Biden administration would push for an economic policy, a foreign policy for the middle class, as it clearly stated, that essentially does not try to change Chinese economic behavior anymore, but tries to basically go beyond China. And we have seen some signals in this regard in 2020 with subsidies for supply relocations of the magnitude of $2.3 billion launched by the Japanese government, and trilateral initiatives between Japan, India, and Australia, and new budget allocations that are hinting at that movements again. So it would be fantastic then, not necessarily during Tsuruoka Sensei's talk, but also during the discussion, to see how Japan fits within these developments. And so this gives me the chance to leave the floor to Tsuruoka Sensei, who is going to tell us more about also Japan's positioning in this trilateral trilateral relationship. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be part of this, and very much I congratulate the launch of the new EU-Asia project at EUI. Yes, the topic, the title of my remarks today is Japan-Europe, U.S. dynamics in the Indo-Pacific era. So I try to be try to offer a broader perspective rather than just focusing on Japan. So looking at I think the past 15 or 20 years of the evolution of Japan-Europe-US triangle, or this relationship, I think there are three factors which are quite important. One is the China factor. So how to deal with China very much has shaped the evolution of this relationship first, and then Trump factor. Of course, Trump factor is a bit newer than other factors, but still, over the past 4 or 5 years, the Trump factor was there, and that influenced quite a lot the evolution of this relationship. And thirdly, I would like to emphasize the connectivity factor, meaning that the fact that what takes place in Asia, for example, affects Europe more. So this sort of the level of the connectivity has increased quite a lot, and that has, of course, influenced the evolution of this relationship, Japan-Europe-US relationship. But what I think I talk about today is still very much a series of fragmented elements. So perhaps that might be my fault, but it's not quite wholly my fault, because the reality is fragmented and the reality is quite diverse. So I don't want to try to adjust the reality to my theory, of course, that's not what I should do. So just to offer a fragmented series of elements that have been influencing the evolution of this relationship. And first, the China factor. Yes, China has always been a quite difficult issue, actually, not just between Europe and Japan, but also between Japan and the US as well, because we don't want to pretend that our interests vis-a-vis China are 100% identical to those of the United States. That's not true. So we should not pretend that. And of course, between United States and Europe, there are various differences. So our job always has been to manage our differences. So that is a sort of a overall sort of a foundation on which we need to think about more concrete cooperation agenda. So and also facing the Sino-American tensions or Sino-Japanese tensions, I fully understand that there have been a sense of fear among Europeans about the fear of entrapment. So you don't want to be drawn into Sino-Japanese conflict or Sino-American tensions or conflict or whatever. So but based on that, I think now the situation, the role of the meaning of the China factor is, I think, quickly changing from a element or from the factor to divide us to a factor that unites us, because I think one of the biggest reasons for that, I think, has to do with the changing perceptions, European perceptions of China. So the Europeans are getting more tough on China, and they're more concerned about Chinese behaviors. So that sort of a forms a good foundation for us to think about more cooperation. So look at the EU-Japan relationship. So it used to be that the China was a very negative element, negative factor in the EU-Japan relationship. So remember what we were talking about 15 years ago or so. The EU's the talks about the idea of lifting the EU arms embargo on China, and Japan was very upset about that. So but now the EU and the European countries and the Europeans as a whole are very much more concerned about Chinese behaviors, not just in terms of economic issues, but also in terms of security issues as well. And so now China can be now seen more as a item for cooperation rather than item of conflict or tensions. And in the transatlantic relationship as well, there are, as Andrew talked about, there are more hopes about transatlantic cooperation on China. Of course, it's easy to say so, but in substance, so what could be achieved, that's still an open question. But still, at least what we can say is that the more willingness to cooperate between Japanese, Europeans, and Americans on China. And so I think the atmosphere has changed quite a lot. So that I think at least a great news. And now the Trump factor. So yes, it's very easy to complain about Trump's approach to foreign policy, as America First approach, or other very unpredictable behaviors of the Trump administration. Yes, it's very easy to complain about that. But looking at the consequences or effect of Trump factor in Japan-Europe relations, for example, it was, from my perspective, it was quite positive. So in a sense, Trump has brought Japanese and Europeans closer. So under the Trump administration, under Trump's very rhetoric against free trade or multilateralism, so that brought the EU and Japan closer. So the EPA between the EU and Japan was one of the sort of a byproduct of Trump's harsh rhetoric about free trade and multilateralism. Of course, it's not the whole factor, the most important factor, I don't think so, but still, it was sort of helpful in pushing Japanese and Europeans to concluding negotiations. So it was not not a coincidence that the EU-Japan FTA negotiations got concluded in 2017, the first year of the Trump administration. So and also under Trump, there are now more discussions about strategic autonomy in the European Union. So first and foremost, it was very much part of a plan B type of idea in foreign security policy dimensions. So it was very much about autonomy from the United States. But particularly last year, as a result of pandemic, now the more and more discussions are taking place on open strategic autonomy, the more economic dimension of it, which is very much about autonomous from China. So it's quite interesting that this whole debate got more active and intensified during the Trump administration. So but that is a sort of a new element in thinking about the future evolution of this Japan-Europe-US relationship. And first, just a small sort of a negative, possible negative consequences of the end of the Trump administration is that during the Trump administration, role of Japan, or value of Japan as a partner for Europe was very much heightened as a partner sharing values more than with Americans. But that sort of a political period of political rhetoric is now over. So that perhaps you could argue that the value of Japan, relative value of Japan, is now in decline because of more optimistic talks about the revival of transatlantic cooperation between the US and Europe. So finally, just let me say a few words on the connectivity factor. I think the logic is quite simple, that what takes place in Asia affects Europe more and affects the United States more. But as for the US, the Americans have been very much aware of this for many years. So I think the new element is that what takes place in Asia affects Europe more and more, not just in economic terms, but also in political security terms as well. So that explains why the more and more European countries and EU as well are getting more engaged in the Indo-Pacific security issues. So including by sending naval vessels to the region. So I'm personally very much a fan of Europeans sending ships to Asia, but what role we expect Europeans to play, that is still a open question. We don't have a clear answer. Not just Japanese, but Americans actually don't have a clear answer what they expect Europeans to do in Asia, in Asian security. So some Americans argue that yes, they're sending ships to Asia is fine, but it's not a good way of using Europe's precious, limited defense and security resources and assets. So some Americans argue that Europe should better focus on European issues, and then Americans could focus on Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. But so this is very much an idea of geographical division of labor. But I don't think that's really the way we should take, because if you proceed with the idea of geographical division of labor, then we will end up having different perceptions, different strategic perceptions, different threat perceptions. So that will be, I think, harmful for trilateral cooperation, not just on China, but also on other issues as well. So as long as we say and we believe that this is a community of values and a community of interest, then I think too much geographical division of labor is not the way we should take. But anyway, so the China factor and the Trump factor per se, maybe now it's gone, but the Trump phenomenon is likely to continue. So we will have to continue to think about this, and the connectivity factor. So these three factors are going to influence the future course of this relationship. So we don't have a clear answer, but we will need to keep our eyes on those issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I leave the floor to Dr. Eva Peshova, head of the Japan program at VUB, I would like to remind everybody that you have the chance to engage with our panelists by just inputting your question or your remarks and comments into the chat. And I'll make sure that you get sufficient space. Now, without further ado, Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giulio, and thanks to EUI for inviting me for this very high-profile and timely event. It's a great pleasure to be here, although I wish I was in Florence in person. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to discuss some of the key challenges behind the EU-Japan relationship, or I would say how to, this kind of major brainstorming session of how to make this relationship more constructive or effective in addressing some of the Indo-Pacific challenges. As the title of this session suggests, one of the main challenges is actually how to bring in the United States, how to incorporate the transatlantic relations or eventually make the trilateral cooperation work in a somehow effective manner. In a way, we are approaching this tight multilateral model that Natalie Tocci mentioned, the high quality grouping of partners that should normally agree on those core values and actually go the deepest that we can possibly imagine. Now, by giving me this opportunity, I understand that's a price that the organizers made me pay. I have been asked to do the daunting task of having to criticize my my fellow colleagues on these panels, which are all esteemed and top thinkers in their domains, with brilliant ideas, and we have been working on these issues for a very long time, and that I hope to be continuing working with. So I realized that I'm also running the risk to ruin our friendships, and I have to apologize for that in advance. If it is so, and if you have anything against it, please blame the EUI and Giulio in person. Now, my comments and criticisms have been based on mostly also the papers that I've had the pleasure to read in advance, so not just your presentations today. And I also use the opportunity to voice some of the questions, so there will be just one question to each of the panelists, if that's okay. And I will start with Gudrun. So Gudrun took us on this fascinating journey across the three existing European Indo-Pacific concepts that have been presented so far by France, Germany, and Netherlands, by a very thorough comparison on the structure, the type of the document, the content, obviously the similarities, differences, including the type of geographies actually that these papers addressed, and the list of national initiatives that they contain. So if I'm actually, voicing some of those criticisms or comments, it's also in view of improving perhaps the quality of the paper as it will be published. Now, that in itself is a very valuable contribution to the ongoing academic debate and policy debate on the Indo-Pacific in Europe. Now, one thing that I find interesting and that could be perhaps elaborated on a little bit more in detail is really the EU position or stance, because we focus separately on the three countries, but what is interesting is this internal dynamic in which it interplays. So we may have thought that basically it is just Germany and Netherlands pushing for a common European stance that will result or is resulting now in the upcoming EU Indo-Pacific strategy, which of course is not the case. This bottom-up process is just part of the process. And as I personally like to see this whole Indo-Pacific internal European process to be, it's part of a, also again, as Natalie said, it's part of a kind of identity building process internally of the European Union as a security and foreign policy actor. What is interesting, for instance, if you look in detail, the French strategy, the first one, already mentioned the importance of European perspective and being presented itself as being part of a European perspective on the issue. But for the longest time, Brussels never reacted to the French strategy, and quite the opposite, actually. One of the reasons why it did not want to use the Indo-Pacific term was because the French were already using it. So it did not want to feel that it copies basically one of the member states. But it was, as you correctly said, it was after the Germany and the Netherlands eventually pushed for it that we eventually now see the concept taking shape more in a more real form. So this whole internal dynamic, I think, could be elaborated on a little bit. Why these three countries? Of course, we know one has a territory, the other one has a trade interest, but of course, Germany and Netherlands are not the only trading countries that have an interest in the Indo-Pacific. So is it really just a bottom-up process? What has been discussed in parallel in the External Action Service, in the European Council? What are perhaps the positions of other member states, without getting, of course, too much in details? But I think that that whole process that has been lasting now for almost 5 years is very interesting in itself. Another interesting point in your presentation, in your paper, and in the Indo-Pacific debate is the lack of emphasis on the United States. And I think that that's precisely, well, what this session is about, that really should be highlighted. We focus on cooperation with partners. That's the European way, the Sinatra doctrine. It's cooperation with like-minded partners. But we always mean Japan, we mean Korea, we mean Australia, New Zealand, and the United States are missing. And it could be partly the Trump effect, obviously, but it cannot be just that. Since we're talking about Asia or Indo-Pacific nowadays, and we're talking like-minded partners, it's really striking not to see a greater emphasis on the United States. And here would be my question also, although I'll finish on another note. Where do you see, and that's a basic of, this is the basis of this session, where do you see the cooperation with the United States? And how would you incorporate it perhaps in your paper? Shall we stick to this trilateral format? Where does the Quad stands? Why do you think it has not been actually explicitly mentioned in the German or the Dutch strategies more prominently? And do you think it will be part of the upcoming EU Indo-Pacific strategy? So where does the EU stand? And finally, and that's obviously, that seems to be quite logical in our fields, because we are writing and commenting developments that are taking place currently. Of course, the paper needs some updating, reflecting some of the latest developments, the blog post last week by the High Representative Vice President Josep Borrell on the issue, and also the fact that we are now very close to see the publication of the Indo-Pacific Strategy Outlook, whatever that means, whatever the name will be, probably at the end of April already. So perhaps just a little bit of updating would greatly help. Now I'll move to Andrew. Andrew, thank you very much for this extremely insightful look into the economic dimension of this relationship. I must admit that not being an economist myself, I learned a lot. You explain very well the shifts that have been behind, well, the Trump versus the Biden policy, but also in the bilateral transatlantic relationship especially. The key message to me, and first while reading your paper, was great, obviously, now the importance of Europe has grown from the moment that we realized and the United States realized that the competition cannot be taking place exclusively on the military front, but has to be accompanied, has to be more comprehensive, and has this trade and technology component. And therefore, of course, European Union, Europe as a trading partner cannot be left alone. Now, while that was an encouraging development, you immediately give us a long list of challenges that you have also mentioned in your presentation. And as I was reading through this list, I was hoping that every time, you know, it's also almost over. And then you go through the thin, and then you go through the thick, and then the list continues. And then you say, okay, well, then maybe we will have eventually some breakthrough in this and this and this domain. But there are these challenges looming ahead. So frankly, I thought it was actually a little bit, I wouldn't say discouraging, but it made me lose the enthusiasm a little bit. And I realized how much there is beyond the surface, how much more needs to be done, and how much easier it is said than done when we talk about trilateral cooperation. And you said it right at the end, is saying this is not necessarily about trilateral cooperation, this is not necessarily about US, Japan or EU, Japan, but it's really just transatlantic. So at some point I got carried away into the wave of only transatlantic relations and only trade, and really going in detail into many of those issues that need to be addressed. Now, my question actually automatically, that as I was reading your paper, that came to my mind was, how come actually it works with Japan? How come the EU-Japan relationship managed to overcome these issues? Oh, actually, it's not explicit in your paper, but perhaps I would presume that that's the case. And how come it is an issue in the transatlantic one? And eventually, where can Japan help in that case? Can Japan be a bridge to actually making the two transatlantic partners working closer together? And how? So what could we learn basically by looking at the US-Japan relationship, since we seemingly have really the core basis of same values and approaches, and even strategically also, okay, we can have some differences, but we do agree on main of the on the bulk of commonalities. How come we cannot overcome that, and can we learn something from the US-Japan relationship, or what role Japan could play in this? And perhaps, and this is just a sort of a kind of advice or critical comment to your paper, after all this pessimism that you take us through on the long lists of to-do lists and challenges ahead, it is only at the very end that you mentioned connectivity and standard setting for new technologies as some of the progress, as some of the lights at the end of the tunnel. It would be great perhaps to elaborate more on these, not just for the sake of giving us a little bit of hope, but because I believe connectivity, at least from the European perspective, is really a key issue. It is a key issue in the EU-Japan relationship as well. It is something that we've been working on with our Japanese colleagues since 2 years now. Progress, of course, remains to be done, but it would be very, very interested to see where concretely on the connectivity agenda we could bring the United States in, beyond just the most of the remarks that we hear. Yes, there is the Blue Dot Network, and there are many of those initiatives elsewhere, and let's connect the connectivity initiatives. If there is progress, if really we agree on that, where it is, what can we effectively do together? And finally, Michito-san, thank you also for, actually, I would say that your presentation and your paper kind of brings it all together and sums it up very nicely, very clearly. Entrapment is what we are facing. Entrapment is what we are fearing. China, US, and connectivity are really the three key issues. Connectivity without talking necessarily infrastructure connectivity. There's very little to add on China. you say it all. It's been both a hinder and a blessing. Same finally as the Trump presidency in some respect. And I find I agree with you that it has been instrumental, especially for the EU-Japan relationship. Although again, I believe it's been the last drop, perhaps. I believe that there's been so much done between the EU and Japan beforehand that we managed to achieve this point because of all this trajectory that has been done before. I tend to kind of worry about the strategic autonomy trap. And that's just a little caveat. That's of course a very important debate in Europe. It's a extremely important and development. But you would often mix it up, or some voices in Europe sometimes mix it up with, we don't need the United States in that case, and we can do it alone. And but doing it alone is really not the basis of this of strategic autonomy. It could be quite the opposite. And as some of the speakers have said in the previous panel, I believe, it is absolutely crucial to keep the united front. In fact, China is a keen supporter of the European strategic autonomy, precisely because it knows it will not be effective tomorrow, and because that it pushes a little bit more, or fragments, if you want, a united international front. It pushes a more pluricentric or world that eventually benefits the rise of China. You touched upon one very important question that was really there at the back of my mind, but you already came or concluded actually with it, is what is in fact Japan's view, or what Japan thinks would be the role for the European Union, for Europeans to play in Europe. We often hear criticisms, we always hear that we're not doing enough, but we don't hear enough what we should be doing. So if you say that your future paper, or that these are just fragments because it's because the reality is fragmented, but perhaps one hint to make it less fragmented, and to give perhaps a overarching form of your paper, it would be great if you could incorporate what do you think would be the Japanese idea of Europe's role in the region, also in relation within the scope of the trilateral cooperation, ideally, because I personally believe that getting closer with the United States would help, between EU and US would help Japan to kind of get back into its comfort zone, because it would kind of close the circle and be a reassuring for Japan. But that's just one element, and it doesn't, of course, go enough into details. So to conclude, besides, of course, thanking all the three speakers for giving me some homework and things to think of, I would just, I'm just wondering where to head next. And this is just to follow up on the topic of this session, and perhaps just to flag the question out there. What really could be the next steps for Japan, Europe, and the United States? I mean, should we launch consultation mechanisms? Should we perhaps put together a long list, as Andrew did, a long list of commonalities and differences per areas? Maybe it has been done already. And then pick the topics, pick the issues that bring us together, and then think of the best possible formats on where to and how to work, because we need to start working now. This is the best time, and of course I'm sure Giulio and his colleagues, and it's also what we are working on at the Japan program VOP. We very much realize that this is a unique momentum to not be left to pass. But it would be great if we join our brains together and think of really what should be the next concrete way ahead. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Eva. Put even more meat, and not by chance I'm behind a fireplace here. I will actually add the three questions that we have been asked, and I will give the first one to Andrew, because it's pertinent to what Eva has also mentioned in terms of the way forward, and really what you concluded with your paper, Andrew. Do you think essentially that the EU has been giving in to China's calls for multipolarity? And I'm paraphrasing the question here. When it signed the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. And it would be great if we have your transatlantic perspective here, but also what is the sense that you get in Berlin of how the Europeans in Berlin and Brussels understand the answer to that question. And then there is a question that actually finds me a bit in agreement by an anonymous attendee. That's for Gudrun. It's a tough question, you might say. That is, if essentially the US if the US position is an aggressive one, it's a position that is aiming at containing China. You might say that the last year of the Trump administration was not strategic competition, but it was strategic fighting. It was kinka, as the Japanese say. It was a lot of mud. It was a mud fight. Does this bring then us to a less comfortable position in our dealings with China, meaning that it's the feasibility of a multilateral approach and a constructive one is less feasible? And then the final question that I had earlier on from Jeffrey Hornigood, Rand Corporation, is for Tsuruoka Sensei. If the US advocates free and open Indo-Pacific, isn't there a contradiction with its refusal to join CPTPP? And I'll leave it here. Let's go in the order of the program. So Gudrun, Andrew, and Tsuruoka Sensei.
Okay, first of all, thanks, Eva. Our friendship still stands. Thank you for the constructive remarks, and I will take on board this addressing the dynamic within the European Union. Off the cuff, I would say, as long as France was doing this alone and sort of sold it as defending national interests, even if mentioning the EU, it was kind of hard to respond. And then the factor I already mentioned earlier, the ASEAN, the fact that ASEAN was very skeptical about the concept, but already in 2019, Germany and France, there were some ministerial, foreign minister level consultations, and there is a passage that they want to cooperate on pushing the Indo-Pacific forward. So there are some dynamics going on behind it. And I would say the EU probably had the same reluctance that Germany had and the Netherlands in using the term Indo-Pacific, with China clearly seeing it as, you know, an effort of containing China, and whoever signs up to this concept is basically an adversary. About the US absence in all the papers, and that includes Borrell's blog last week. The US is absent, although there is one sentence in this new agenda for transatlantic cooperation that was published in December 2020 about cooperating in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, you have to keep in mind that the German paper was published before the elections in the United States. And it was written in the high prime time of Donald Trump's policy. So I think this might be one of the reasons, but it's certainly not the only one. So it's not only the Trump factor, but I think one reasoning on the German side, and I think Michito said the same, Trump is gone, but Trumpism is not necessarily gone, and we don't know what will happen 4 years from now. So I think there is this reasoning that, you know, we should probably not jump to the conclusion now that we go full-fledged into transatlantic relations or Japan, US on the same page, neglect everything else, because that's the danger, that we jump ship with the US and then 4 years from now, we're back where we started. So it's a more cautious attitude, I would argue. And on China, we're not exactly on the same page. I mean, the EU does not have a containment strategy against China. It does not see China as a direct military threat to itself. We have, as the EU, we have neglected the regional aspect of that, and we're only warming up to looking at this, you know, the regional perspective and looking at China through the regional lens, so to speak, which is very necessary. So what I see in these papers is that on the one hand, if we say, you know, we have an inclusive approach that includes China, and then the next sentence is we cooperate with the US. It is not very credible, but I agree there is a contradiction or a dilemma how we will solve this puzzle and how we will do this, because in the session this morning, they talked about this compartmentalization. This might actually not work. I mean, it depends on China, whether China lets us compartmentalize, you know, trade investment on the one hand, and things like, you know, we want to cooperate with you on climate change and non-proliferation and biodiversity for no price. And we haven't thought through what our priorities are when these choices have to be made. And if compartmentalization does not work in the way we had anticipated. I think what we see in the papers on the Indo-Pacific, and probably what we will see in the EU one, this argument, we are interested in a rules-based order because it's the only thing that protects us from hegemonic, you know, attitude that might makes right. And we have enough like-minded countries on that issue in the region. So think back, there was, I think it was under Obama, there was a joint statement, Clinton and was it Mogherini? Or, no, it was Ashton, exactly. You go to the Asia Pacific and the first thing you say is, you know, we will have transatlantic cooperation in the region. It did not go down well in the region. And this is also why countries like New Zealand are treading a very fine line, because if you define like-minded in an ideological way, and it's only democracies that qualify, your list in the region will shrivel very fast. So you have to take into consideration that, first of all, the understanding of multilateralism is different. This is a contested concept. And second, that there is a diversity in the region which we have to address. And India is the best example, you know, and the trend we see India going in a direction that is probably not exactly convergence. I think I'll leave it at that. Oh, I had the question with the US.
Yes, very briefly, thank you.
If it is aggressive. I mean, that's the scenario that the EU wants to prevent, right? And it's very clear in all the papers and documents that there is no appetite for a broader decoupling, be it economically or politically. And so, I mean, if you read papers like the one that the planning division of the State Department put out last November or early December, where the European Union is basically the playground for US and China to battle, or the battleground. This is not in our interest, of course. The question is what we will do if push comes to shove. And I'm advancing to what will be discussed in the next panel. The other country that is missing in the documents is Taiwan. You know, and this might well be one of the hot issues that we have to think through. What will we do if some sort of escalation happens there? But we are already in an uncomfortable position. And I mean, Michito, I think it's what you said about the Trump factor, that it brought us together, the EU and Japan. I just don't want us to fall back into this, you know, okay, you have done your duty, now the US is back. Because as I said, we don't know what will be in 4 years from now.
Thank you. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Julio. So I'll answer your Kai question first, and then brief comment on Eva's excellent thoughts on the paper as well. So on the comprehensive investment agreement, I mean, I think there's a sort of low ambition strategic autonomy on China policy, which is Europe charts its own path, differentiation, this kind of approach. And then I think there's a high ambition version of strategic autonomy, which says we define our goals and approach, we figure out which partners we need to work with to achieve them, and then we work on shaping and defining that wider framework, making sure it's something that we can live with on the overall approach to China that others are taking too, which I think right now means taking advantage of the opportunity that this kind of more coalition-based consultative approach on the US side kind of now gives us. I think the handling of the Kai politically was really a missed opportunity. It was the kind of low ambition version of strategic autonomy at the expense of the high ambition one. I think we have still somewhat a window to redress some of the initial political harm that was caused, but it's very clear with the Kai that China wanted to take advantage of this window, which described as a window of opportunity on the European side, essentially to break the new administration's coalition-based approach. And so it made all of these late offers to close the deal. And this was very clear that they wanted to do it in the window before the new administration took place for precisely this reason. The effect of Europe doing so, I think, has then been to reduce trust among other partners. It plays into all the concerns that existed already about the European approach to China. It basically looked like we were benefiting from Chinese fears about a new coalition to secure a bilateral economic deal. So it was a kind of, it looked to others, the US, but not just the US, a number of others too, like a kind of free riding. I don't think the agreement itself is necessarily so damaging. If it had been signed at another time, it would have had a very different kind of political reception. It's not worse in quality than RCEP or the US-China Phase 1 trade deal. I think at this stage be kind of an approach on the US side that is just kind of park it, move past, don't turn this into a big political win, even if there has been some degree of an erosion of trust around this. I think the question is rather whether we can get back to an approach that that does really take advantage of this sort of fairly rare moment of opportunity that was not of the same nature the last time the US was proposing deep, consultations with the EU on Asia, the things that Gudrun was talking about back when Kurt Campbell was doing this, kind of a decade ago, where I think it was much more of a kind of Europe as +1. Europe as +1 looks like on security issues in Asia, has a particular quality to it. But I think there's a kind of defensiveness about thinking about it in that way when we're talking about these issues of strategic economic, trade, technology, these things. Europe operates as a peer on this, and I think just has much more scope to shape and condition the wider approach to this than was the case before. And I think there's still some hang-ups on this. And as I think Gudrun said in her comments, I think there's still this nervousness and tentativeness about being asked to do things that you don't want to, rather than stepping out and really defining what this is. I mean, I think there's still a question on Kai as to whether it represents just this, as I was mentioning in the remarks, this kind of old paradigm, kind of this old path-dependent approach, the same approach that we've basically been taking to China since the WTO, at a period, during a period in which the decoupling agenda is really there on the Chinese side. There is the push for decoupling right now, dual circulation, redoubling of what the EU chamber described as a redoubling of China's drive to build self-reliance. Xi Jinping talks about tightening international production chains dependence on China to form a countermeasure and deterrent capability against foreigners. We've got the dual circulation strategy development. We've got a significant shift in what's going on the Chinese side. And when we're talking about decoupling, this cannot be just understood as an impetus that's coming from the United States right now. There does have to be a revisiting of some of these questions when it comes to what's going on the Chinese side. And European business groups are raising this, BDI is raising this, EU chamber is raising this. It's not actually permeated some of the political choices yet. And I still think that the Kai arguably, I mean, again, we can park it and move on European economic strategy too. But I think if there's a critique of that, it's that some of the approach to these mechanisms of enforcement and any of the expectations that we're really going to get what was promised on this just look in some cases kind of quite illusory, even aside from all the other questions that people have about the Kai. On the on Ava's point, and I'll try and be shorter on this. I actually, my thin list at least was supposed to be the kind of more viable, pretty kind of doable list between the two sides. This is the kind of low-hanging fruit version where I think we can actually make quite a bit of progress. Yes, there are differences, but on connectivity finance, I think there's the scope to make progress. Supply chain cooperation, I think there's scope to make progress. Some of the genuinely shared approaches on some of the China negotiating strategy, certainly joint WTO cases, we've done that before, we can do more of that. I think broadening coordination on Chinese access to emerging technologies, not difficult, easily elevated from what we've already done before. I think regulatory and standards cooperation on emerging technologies, as you meant, I mean, that one that I think is going to move ahead. I think if we can get some progress on the US side in looking at some of the antitrust instruments, some of the other approaches to kind of Belt and Road type Chinese subsidies, I don't see why we can't make progress on that either. I think the harder thing is the kind of more politically kind of polarized and sensitive areas, data, industrial policy, these sorts of things, and the kind of the thick list, even some of the climate cooperation on that. Japan, I think, did actually perform a very helpful role in the last few years with all of the data free flow with trust efforts and the push through the G7 on that. I think there's reason to be a bit more optimistic than in the last few years, just because of domestic developments on the US side when it comes to the kind of approach to Silicon Valley, approach to antitrust policy, approach to privacy. I think there's domestic momentum that means that we can have a kind of different quality of discussion on these sorts of things, where previously I think the European approach was just seen to be unfairly going after US firms. I think the European approach is a bit more consistent with where at least the Democrats, but I think the wider political debate on the US is. So I think there's more hope than for reasons that have nothing to do with Japan, have nothing to do with the EU, in terms of just a bit more of a convergence on some of the technology and data related questions. But I think there's no question that, you know, if you compare TTIP and the EU-Japan FTA, it's clear what's politically sensitive in Europe. If you compare data questions and the data adequacy agreement, and then you look at Privacy Shield and Schrems II and all of these sorts of things, it's clear what's politically sensitive in Europe, and where the agreement with Japan just isn't. And I think there's still, on these politically difficult areas, which are going to require a lot more kind of a push and some compromises and difficult moves on different sides. You know, I think these things are just going to be much harder. The final point, though, on connectivity, I do think that's an area where there's no reason why there can't be pretty good progress. The EU's been, Japan clearly mobilized resources and set strategy on connectivity well before the US and EU did. It's still the pace setter, it's still the kind of gold standard on doing a lot of this. The EU approach has just lagged behind significantly. It is quite structurally similar to the US model that was being put forward through the kind of financing models and things, de-risking investments in infrastructure, this sort of thing. I think the hope is now that but in terms of the actual qualitative progress that was made since the partnership agreement was signed with Japan, I think the issues there have been just all the infighting that's continued to take place on the EU side about how these resources are used, how far one can really strategically mobilize behind this, the lack of political momentum. I think we're getting past that now. I think the really positive thing now is that I think there's an understanding of the value and salience of doing this, both in its own right and as a kind of critical element of the partnerships with Japan, India, as I hope we'll see at the upcoming EU-India summit, where there should be a substantial new partnership agreement then on connectivity announced. I think some of the internal challenges are still there. I think, and some of the internal challenges are there on the US side too. I don't think they've got to a place. I think it's much more uncomfortable for the US system and the European system to do this as well as Japan has been able to. But I think that's an area where there's no deep political obstacles. They're almost more bureaucratic ones to be able to get to the right place on that.
By bringing in connectivity and the role of Japan, also with regards to the question raised by Jeffrey Hornung, the floor is all for Tsuruoka Sensei, and you can go on for 8 minutes. I'm sorry for extending the panel's time by 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the great comments and good question. As for Eva's point, yes, I fully understand that. Yes, it's now Japan's turn to come up with a strategic vision on including on Europe's role in Asia. So I think it's a broad topic. So technology issues and standardization and the data flow and those issues are also quite important. But let me say a few words on the military side of this. Because now that this year is going to be quite interesting because a lot of European vessels are coming to Asia. So how we can make use of those occasions, that's very much something we need to think more about. The first thing is that the sending strategic message to Beijing is always one of the most important elements of European sending ships to Asia. So because China's preferred discourse is that only Japanese or Americans are criticizing Chinese about Chinese actions in East China Sea or South China Sea, but that's not true. So there are so many other countries which are getting more and more concerned about Chinese behaviors. So they're sending strategic message that we are on board, Europeans are on board as well. We are concerned, we are watching you. So that's sending that sort of message, I think is always a important part of this exercise. And the second element is that despite the fact that the Japanese government has yet to come up with a coherent strategy, but I very much believe that it is in Japan's interest to see more cooperation, operational cooperation between Americans and the Europeans in the Indo-Pacific region. So the UK or France cooperating more with American forces, that's actually quite already happening. But somehow that both French and Brits don't quite sell that aspect. And I sort of understand why, because Britain, for example, in a slogan under the Global Britain, of course, they want to showcase the British deployment to Asia as a British one rather than being overshadowed by other countries. So it's quite understandable. But still, seen from Tokyo, I would like to see more US-UK joint element or France-US joint element. And that is on the ground already happening. So take the example of the carrier strike group, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, which is coming later this year. And it is actually a joint, fully joint UK-US carrier strike group, because on board the aircraft carrier are to be American F-35B alongside with British F-35B. And carrier strike group will include a US Navy destroyer as well. So and it's going to be a real joint US-UK carrier strike group. And that is one of the reasons why Chinese are quite concerned about the implications of this. So I think it's a great idea to sell this aspect more, rather than just keep talking that this is a flagship project of the UK, national flagship project. That's not the case. And also the France as well. The French Navy and the US Navy have been cooperating quite well in the Indo-Pacific area. So one of the very striking examples of joint training took place last December between French, Japanese, and American navies. And there was a French nuclear attack submarine in the region, and we did an anti-submarine warfare exercise. So what we did was that the Americans and Japanese sort of hunted the French submarine. So that's sort of a serious, more high-end type of exercise and training have already been taking place. And France and a French submarine actually visited Guam twice, and the American the base helped everything that the French submarine needed. So that sort of element is quite important. So from Japanese perspective, it is about a plug-in capability of Europe, plug into not just the US-Japan alliance, but also the US-Australia alliance as well. So this sort of a element, I think, is quite important in military terms from a Japanese perspective, and also I think from an American perspective as well. And yes, about the question from Jeffrey Hornan, and a question about the contradiction between commitment to FOIP on one hand and still the reluctance to join CPTPP. Yes, that's, I think, a huge, serious contradiction. So I personally believe that it's in America's own interest to join CPTPP. I wouldn't deliberately use the term rejoin TPP. I think it's a bit sensitive. So to join CPTPP, or perhaps we could change the name again as well, if Americans are really serious in joining this. So because the CPTPP is, I think, the most effective framework in terms of building a coalition of like-minded partners, mainly vis-a-vis China. So it's quite effective. So I remember that, I think it was back in 2015 or something, the Defense Secretary Ashton Carter said that TPP is as important as another aircraft carrier. I believe that the TPP is more important than just one aircraft carrier. I don't know how many aircraft carrier it's what, but so there's a balance between military engagement, military commitment, and economic engagement. So how to make a balance right, I think, is a huge challenge. And in that context, although I would emphasize the importance of TPP, but still, the TPP will not be able to address all the challenges in the region, because the TPP is now 11 countries. The Britain wants to join it, but 11 countries, it's just part of other countries in the region. So there are various non-members, most notably India, of course, and ASEAN. Looking at ASEAN, 10 countries of ASEAN. Not all countries are in TPP. So still, even if US joins TPP, still the other tools or other frameworks will be needed as well to get all the ASEAN countries on board. Of course, it's just difficult. and Myanmar and these other countries are difficult countries as well. So it's just it's not an easy task, but still, what is important is that yes, the joining TPP and going beyond that is the important. My sort of initial impression of the Biden administration's approach to multilateralism in the Asia Pacific region is, or in the world, is that the Biden prioritizes Quad and G7 first and foremost. So but Quad and G7, these are very exclusive clubs. Yes, of course, the smaller, the more effective. Yes, that's quite true. But at the same time, at some point, we will have to think more about going beyond those very exclusive clubs. So going beyond Quad and going beyond G7. So the CPTPP is one such a choice, but even beyond that, we will have to think about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. We have gone over time, 5 minutes. This was very comprehensive, as comprehensive perhaps as the Indo-Pacific. We've had perspectives from Europe, transatlantic perspectives, and the Japanese perspective on issues ranging from military presence to economics, trade, global governance, and economic security. This is a perfect pitch also for the next panel, and I suggest that you stay tuned. It will start in 10 minutes, and we will see similar questions being addressed, not to mention the elephant in the room that Gudrun was referring to, Taiwan. So please stay tuned, and thanks very much for following us, and keep an eye on the EU-Asia project, because we will see all of these contributions take a paper format that is going to be easily accessible online. Have a very nice day, everybody, or a nice evening. Bye-bye.